Chapter 3 Santa Ana. It was hot in the Sonoran Desert, over 100 degrees in the shade. In a car without air conditioning, it was like being in an oven turned on low. I had learned to make beef jerky that way, leaving the thin strips of meat on an oven rack to dehydrate overnight. The windows of the Chevrolet were rolled down, and the hot air fanned my face. I felt like a piece of beef jerky, dry and lifeless. Can you be more specific as to what we are going to do on this journey to power? I asked Carlos, pulling down the visor to shield my eyes from the glare of the road. Carlos glanced at me in spurts as he drove. It's difficult to explain, he said, slowing down for a curve. We're just going to proceed without any specific plan and allow the Spirit to guide us. That's what I do whenever I come to Mexico to see Don Juan. I abandon myself to the circumstances as they present themselves. That sounds fine to me, but are we just going to drive aimlessly, or are we heading somewhere in particular? We are going to the Yaki towns of Vicara and Potam, with the hope of finding ceremonial masks for the ethnographic museum. That will be our overt maneuver. But essentially, we are searching for power. How will we know when we find it? I asked, wiping the sweat off my forehead with a paper towel. Carlos laughed at my pained expression. We will know because something in us will change. Our perception of the world will change. Either way, our journey begins there, in the Yaki towns. Why there? Because that's where Don Juan and his associates gather to renew themselves. That is where the sorcerers of his group come to restore their power. The terrain from Nogales to Hermosillo was desolate. For miles there was nothing to see except giant saguaro cacti and long spiny ocotillo interspersed with toyon trees and small shrubs. Now and then we passed a dense cluster of prickly pear with small birds pecking at its red fruit. For distraction, I tried to identify as many different types of flora as I could. If I did not recognize a plant, I asked Carlos its name. He seemed very knowledgeable regarding the vegetation of the area. At one time, I wanted to study the medicinal properties of plants, he said. And Don Juan often took me hiking in the desert. Is it possible to survive in the desert? I asked. The Indians used the barrel cactus as a source of water, and of course the fruit of the tuna is edible, he replied, as well as many of the other shrubs and roots, but you have to know about plants. The Pan American Highway cut the flat terrain like a black ribbon. I watched the white line stretching ahead of us until it disappeared near the horizon in a shimmering mirage of vaporous water. To ease my distress, I fanned myself with a cologne-scented handkerchief. Carlos glanced at the white cloth, waving like a flag of truce, and wrinkled his nose. It smells like a rose garden, he said, half smiling. But when he sneezed, I could tell the perfume bothered him. I put the handkerchief back in my purse and popped the chiclet into my mouth. For distraction, I tested myself on how many variety of flora I could actually identify without his help. I could pick out the bisnaga, the tuna, the maguey, which is used to make tequila, the tall yucca that blooms only once every 10 years, and of course the manzanilla and toyon trees, loaded with scrumptious but inedible red berries. Around noon, we came to a stretch of highway that was being repaired. We slowed down to a crawl, and I watched the shirtless road workers manually filling in potholes. A worker with a red kerchief around his head was shoveling tar from a bucket. The other, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat, was rolling the tar out with an implement that looked like an enormous iron. Further down the road, another worker was brushing water on the freshly tarred area, sweeping it with a wet broom, causing steam to form as the water evaporated in the heat. The fresh asphalt looked like a thick strip of melted licorice, good enough to eat. I realized then that I was famished. Except for the soda I had in Nogales, some fruit we had bought at a roadside stand, and some crackers I had found in a bag in the back seat, I had not eaten since Gila Blend. In Nogales, Carlos had offered to feed me, but my fainting spell had left me too upset to eat. It would be 3 hours before we reached Hermosillo, where Carlos said he knew of an excellent restaurant. Resigned, I searched through my purse for some more chewing gum to moisten my throat. The overripe mangoes were fermenting in the plastic sack in the back seat. A pungent odor drifted forward and invaded my nostrils. The smell was familiar, yet not offensive. I closed my eyes and let the scent of mangoes envelop me. As my sinuses cleared, I saw a purple light in the area around my forehead. The space opened up into a scene in front of my eyes. I got a glimpse of Emilito making his special brew of mango liquor. He was wearing a chef's hat and had an apron over his neatly pressed blue overalls. He was in the kitchen of Clara's house, standing in front of the enormous wood-burning stove. "Because you are a tree dweller," he said, "you are entitled to sample this excellent liquor I've brewed." I stared at him dumbfounded. "I didn't know you drank liquor, Emilito, let alone brewed it yourself. Isn't it bad for your health?" "It is," he admitted, with a devil-may-care gleam in his eye. "But this is a special occasion, so we will try some, you and I." I began to feel that familiar panic whenever Emilito broke one of his stringent rules. I had never seen Emilito this relaxed before. He was always so careful about what he ate or drank because of his delicate constitution. A dozen questions and as many fears flooded me. "What is the special occasion?" I asked. "It's my birthday," he said with a childlike squeal. "But I thought one didn't celebrate birthdays in the sorcerer's world." "What about the recapitulation? What about erasing your personal history? What about facing oncoming time? What about them?" he asked, blinking like a bird. He took out of the cupboard 2 exquisite etched liquor glasses. I had never seen them before. In spite of the keen eye I kept on the placement of objects in and about the house, nothing had escaped my scrutiny, for I had been obsessed with determining who lived in the house and what they were up to. I thought that losing one's personal history meant that one didn't focus on the day one was born, let alone celebrate it, I said, admiring the glasses. They were crystal clear, with a delicate stem and the faintest geometric pattern etched in the rim. He carefully set the glasses down on the table. "Where did you ever get that idea?" he asked. "The day you were born is most important." "It's a day I want to forget," I said. He smacked his lips. "Well, if it is important to you, then it is to me." "I don't understand." "It's important because that was the day I began repaying my debt," he explained. "I still don't get it. Can you tell me what you mean? The day you woke up in the harness and lowered yourself down from the tree, and the first moment you laid eyes on me at this very kitchen door, that was the day I began repaying my debt. As far as I'm concerned, that was your birthday, and in a way, mine too. And in case you didn't know it, which you don't because you have a sluggish, lazy mind, that day was exactly 1 year ago from today. So, Taisha, let's drink up and celebrate our freedom. He handed me the sherry glass filled with a yellow-orange thick liquid he had poured out of a clear distillery flask. The kind with the bulbous bottom one sees in a chemist's laboratory. He held up his glass and waited for me to do the same. I had the foresight to know that as soon as our glasses touched, something monumental would happen. I hesitated. I didn't want to toast, and yet I was compelled to follow Emelito's gesture. Reluctantly, I held up my glass and said, "Prost," the way Emelito had, and even tried to smile a bit. Then he insisted we clink glasses. He sipped his liquor delicately, savoring every bit. I cautiously took a sip of mine. I nearly choked. It tasted like sweet turpentine, thick and sticky and warm. Emelito, happy that I was drinking his concoction, looked at me with such hopeful anticipation that I took another sip. "Isn't this really something?" he said, waiting for my reply. "Yes, it is," I said, trying not to grimace. That was all I could say. The liquor had burned my throat, and I wondered if I would ever talk again. He made me drink every drop, and then I passed out. I remember having the most vivid dream. There was Clara and Manfred and gorgeous Nelida. I thought we were at a picnic grounds until I realized it was the back of someone's house. There was an open fire in an oil drum filled with mesquite wood and a grid on top. I smelled pork roasting over mesquite wood. There was a large gathering. Among them, a few were young, but others were old. And one young man in particular was staring at me. They all seemed so happy and bubbling with enthusiasm and carefree delight that I forgot my anxiety, and I was happy too. I focused my gaze on the young man. He seemed to be the center of the group of people who were listening to him talk. I wanted to go over there, but Nelida stopped me. She placed her hand on my shoulder and said, "Stay here, it's not time yet. You'll meet the new Nawal soon, on the other side. Then your task will be to merge the two sides. Only the profoundest affection will allow you to do that." I woke up. Something was poking my ribs. I realized it was the car door handle. We must have gone around a sharp curve because I was slumped against the door. "Damn dogs," Carlos said. "They're always crossing the street when a car's coming. Did we hit it?" I asked, concerned. Carlos reached out an arm to help me straighten up. "No," he said, returning his hand to the steering wheel. "I think we were in luck." I looked up just in time to see a mangy dog slithering off the side of the road into a gully. "Are there people living around here?" I asked, surprised to see a domesticated animal. Except for the construction crew, whom I assume were there to repair the road, some crows and a field mouse darting across the road, I hadn't seen a single sign of life for miles. Naturally, there are people living here, Carlos replied. Near the hills, there are many rancherias. You can't see them from the highway, but they're here. It's dangerous to wander about here at night. People around here shoot first and ask questions later. Who would want to live out here in the middle of the Sonoran desert? I said, hoping the temperamental Chevrolet wouldn't choose this spot to break down. It's not a question of wanting, Carlos corrected me. This entire area was at one time settled by the Yaki Indians before they were relocated to central Mexico. Later, they were brought back by the carloads to work in the mines. We are nearing a town called Santa Ana, named after the famous general who fought at the Alamo and who later became president of Mexico. There's even a song about the town. I've never heard of it. The song, I mean. I've heard of the general. Wasn't he president of Mexico 3 times? He got his leg shot off, and they had a hero's burial for it, Carlos said. And when he fell out of grace, they dug up the leg and threw it in the river. I took a map of Mexico out of the glove compartment and carefully unfolding it, then refolding it to show only the area that concerned us. I wanted to see just how far we were from Hermosillo and that excellent restaurant that Carlos had said was there. As we turned to a curve, a Pemex station and a cluster of buildings came into view. The houses were white with doors painted a brilliant turquoise, the widespread color of the area. Most of the houses in Sonora had their doors painted turquoise or blue. I had always thought it was to represent the blue cloak of the Virgin of Guadalupe. But Carlos said it was because it was an easy color for divers to see, so they wouldn't run into the houses coming around the curves of the narrow streets. It made sense. By the looks of the dirt alleyways and no sidewalks, it would be easy for a truck or car to swerve around a bend too fast and ram a house. This is Santa Ana, Carlos said, slowing down. If you're hungry, we can stop and get something to eat here. I began to salivate with anticipation. But when I saw a dead dog on the roadside, recently hit by a car, my stomach again became queasy. Carlos pulled into the gas station and told me to wait for him in the building next door, which was a restaurant, while he filled the car with petrol. When I entered, I found the large, airy room was deserted. It had a black and white linoleum floor, metal tables with green speckled formica tops, framed pictures of the Swiss Alps on the whitewashed walls, and faded ruffled curtains on the casement windows, whose sashes were painted the traditional blue. There was even a broken-down jukebox in the corner. The place looked like something out of a 50s movie. Any minute I expected a motorcycle gang to ride through the door, and revving their motors ride circles around the tables. I sat down at one of the tables under a ceiling fan that had one of its armatures missing. A lean, middle-aged woman and a girl of about 10 came out from behind a blue curtain that led to another room. The woman seemed groggy from the heat, or perhaps they had been taking a siesta in the next room and were awakened when I entered. I smiled at the woman and winked at the girl, who immediately ran and hid behind the curtain. Confidently, I ordered 2 Peñafiel mineral waters, sin gas in Spanish. The woman smiled and nodded and momentarily returned with one bottle of mineral water, with bubbles and a glass of ice, which she set on the table with a bang. I decided it was safer to drink directly from the bottle and bypass the glass and the ice. I was trying to decipher the handwritten menu when Carlos came in and sat down across from me. "Forget what's on the menu," he said, taking it out of my hand. "In rural Mexico, it's best to order the plate of the day." "And what might that be?" I asked, handing him a napkin I pried out of the stainless steel napkin holder. "I'll find out." He beckoned for the woman to come over. A friendly exchange followed. Carlos attempted to include me in the conversation, but the flow was too fast, so I just nodded dumbly whenever I thought it was appropriate. Then Carlos turned to me and said in English, "She says the stew is fresh. The meat was just killed today." "What kind of meat are we talking about?" I asked, remembering the dead dog on the highway. "It's hard to say," he replied with a shrug. "Let's find out, shall we? I'll order 2 specialties of the house." Since I had agreed we were on a trip of power and that I would offer as little resistance as possible, I accepted his recommendations with a nod. "Stew will be fine," I said, cleaning my spoon with a napkin. Carlos ordered for me, and the woman, in a faded blue skirt and white blouse, gave me an angry look, apparently offended that I had cleaned the silverware. Right away, the woman returned with 2 bowls on a tray, along with a stack of steaming tortillas and a bowl of green chili peppers. She set them on the table, and I was so famished that before she even took the tortillas off the tray, I was already dipped into the stew. I nearly choked. It was the hottest stew I had ever tasted. I literally had to douse the fire in my mouth with mineral water. The waitress chuckled and pretended not to notice my discomfort, but I suspected that she was getting back at me for insinuating that her silverware wasn't clean and had spiked my portion of stew with extra chili powder. "I can't tell what kind of meat this is," I said after downing plenty of water. "The chili powder is too overpowering." The stew, including the meat, looked uniformly brownish red, although I thought I detected a few beans, or perhaps they were bones. I wasn't sure. "Do you suppose it's dog meat?" I asked, peering at the stew. Carlos took a bite. "No, most likely it's beef," he said, and confidently took another bite. On second thought, perhaps it's donkey meat." Regardless of what it was, he made short shrift of his stew. Apparently, he was no stranger to chili peppers either, for he ate a couple of the green ones right from the bowl. I, on the other hand, only picked at my food and stuffed myself with tortillas. "I sure hope I'm not eating someone's pet," I said by way of commentary. "Dogs aren't pets around here," Carlos informed me. "There isn't enough food to feed people, let alone dogs. A dog's life in Sonora is truly worth nothing. They have to scrounge all day for food, where there isn't any." A fly landed on the tortillas, and I quickly shooed it away with a flick of my hand. "How come Mexico is so poor?" I asked, tearing off a bit of the tortilla and leaving the part where the fly had landed. "It seems to me that with all the aid from the United States government, they could grow enough food to feed their population." Carlos shook his head. "There's too much graft and corruption in the higher places, he said. Very little of the money ever trickles down to where it's really needed. Graft and corruption, I said. Two of the meanest words in the English language. I looked at Carlos. His sparking eyes had taken on a somber air, revealing a more serious side of his nature. The revolution didn't free the Mexican people, he continued. It only enslaved them more. Now everything is in the hands of the government, or the big agricultural conglomerates, and the people are still going hungry. What kind of revolution is that, when 90% of the land is still in the hands of a meager 10%? Just then, the little girl turned on the jukebox, and the room was tilled with lively music. It was a ranchera, the typical music of Sonora. The instruments included the small accordion, a harmonica, and some sort of percussion sound, all blended together in a lively beat that reminded me of a German polka. I wondered what the words were and asked Carlos to translate. I thought you said you spoke Spanish, Carlos remarked. I do, in an elementary sort of way. How elementary do you mean? I realized it would be impossible to keep up a pretense. In a country where only Spanish was spoken, one's deficiencies would undoubtedly become clear. It was better that I made a clean breast of things. First year college level, I admitted. I won't expect you to translate everything. Besides, I understand a great deal. Carlos nodded. Apparently, he didn't believe my boasting. The song ended as abruptly as it had begun. The woman came over and stood by the table and chatted with Carlos in a flirtatious manner. I looked on, trying to follow the gist of their conversation. I could tell that she was definitely attracted by Carlos, and that at one point she was saying terrible things about her drunken husband. But when I was unable to follow their batter of jokes and laughter, I gave up listening and began assessing the woman's appearance. I was surprised to see that the woman wasn't as old as she had first seemed. In fact, under her untidy appearance, she was beautiful, with large almond eyes, high cheekbones, and perfectly flawless bronze skin. Her elaborate pendant earrings and long jet black hair that was done in a single braid gave her an exotic look. Incongruously, she wore a large amethyst ring on the index finger of her right hand. There was something about her that looked familiar, yet I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I wondered who she was and what caused her to spend her life working in a desert town in Sonora. I realized I was beginning to feel superior again. The woman's entire life had been decided for her. She had no alternative but to follow the designs of her fate. Then I began to pity her for being stuck in a small town, having to wait on customers at all hours, and to take care of a husband who drinks excessively, and an obviously undernourished, sickly daughter. The only excitement in her dreary life would be going to Mass on Sunday and gossiping with her neighbors about the latest birth or wedding. I thanked my stars that I wasn't in her shoes. My thoughts were interrupted when the woman suddenly turned to me and gave me a fierce stare as if she caught the drift of my feelings. A strange uneasiness came upon me as I remembered a previous time I visited Mexico. I was with Clara, also sitting in a restaurant, only it had been full of customers. I recalled how an intrusive stranger sat down at our table uninvited, and how Clara dispatched him with a similar intensity that allowed him no alternative but to leave not only our table, but the restaurant itself. Now, I felt like doing the same thing, for that woman's stare had cut right through me. On top of that, she had pointed her amethyst-clad finger at me, and instantly I got a headache. The woman gave Carlos a smile, and me another contemptuous look, and left our table. Contemptuous? Leaving no doubt in my mind that I had completely misjudged her strength. That woman is a famous curer, Carlos said in a whisper. She has patients that come to her from all over Sonora. What? You mean she doesn't live here in the back room? I said, stunned. What has she done? What is she doing waiting on tables? I thought this was her place. Ermelina is filling in for her sister, who is visiting relatives in Hermosillo, Carlos explained. I felt lower than a snake in the sand for getting caught in petty judgment. And that girl, I suppose she isn't her daughter. No, that's her sister's child, Carmelita. She looks just like her, doesn't she? I nodded. I would have sworn she was her daughter. I suppose she doesn't have a drunken husband either. No, what makes you say that? She isn't married. I shrugged. Well, anyone could make a mistake, I said to myself. I wanted to leave before the woman came back. I did not want to face her again. I would hate to be her enemy, for I knew enough to tell that the woman had power. If she was a curer, she could also cast spells. And I knew about the fear people had of the evil eye, or mal ojo, of witches. I glanced at the door. Are you expecting someone? Carlos asked. Who would I be expecting? I said. At the same time, I realized that I felt a strange excitement at once again being in what I always regarded as sorcery country, as though I expected Clara to walk in, sit down at our table, and begin chatting in her easy way, just as if nothing happened in the many months that elapsed. From the moment I met Carlos at the university, I wanted to tell him about Clara and Emilito and the sorcerer's house near Navajoa. But a deep barrier always prevented me from talking about them. At one point on our drive, I wanted to tell him of the dream I had with Emilito. But I always felt that telling someone's dreams invites analysis or comment on one's innermost being. So again, I remained silent. Do you think Don Juan will be at his house when we get there? I asked. I began to vigorously shake my head from side to side to clear it. It was a habit I had picked up from the time I stayed with Clara. Whenever I became mentally bogged down or emotionally upset, I allowed myself a moment of relaxation by shaking my head. That movement caused an electric current or a quiver of energy to rush up my spine into the back of my head, causing an involuntary shiver, which helped to throw off any tension. Perhaps, Carlos said, observing me curiously. But as I've said, sometimes he's difficult to track down. Does he hide from you? Not exactly. He just isn't in his house, and no one knows where he's gone or when he will return. That could make doing field research difficult, I said, taking a bite of one of the chili peppers. What if he's not there now? Then we came all this way for nothing? It was fiercely hot, but I pretended the pepper didn't bother me. There was something very impressive, I thought, about eating chili peppers straight from the bowl. I remember my brothers eating chilies from a jar, without flinching, in a kind of childhood test of bravery. Since I had copied everything they did, I also followed them in that endeavor. I got blisters in my mouth from the burns to prove I was just as macho as they were. I realized that the recapitulation hadn't cured me of my deep-rooted competitiveness, for I was doing the same thing now, and I was no longer a child. What do you mean coming from nothing? Carlos said, raising an eyebrow at my grimace. What about delighting in each other's company? That sounded so much like something Clara might have said that I had to laugh. The trip won't be for nothing, Carlos assured me. Remember, our plan to collect masks for the Ethnological Museum. What kind of masks are you looking for? I asked. Pascola masks. Masks carved for the dances that the Yaki Indians perform during their celebrations. They represent animals or spirits. The Yaki Indians believe that by wearing the masks while they dance, they could enter into the spirit world. Do you believe that is possible? I asked. Carlos took a sip of mineral water. Of course, don't you? He asked, turning the question around. I wanted to say I certainly do, but a familiar inner warning bell sounded. Now was not the time or place to talk about my own experiences. In a way, I said casually. They say sorcerers do it all the time, although I don't really know what sorcery is. Perhaps you can tell me. Sorcery is the ability to perceive more than our society and our personal milieu permits us to perceive. He said, sorcerers say that there is more to all of this than meets the eye. But to actually perceive other levels of reality, such as the spirit world, one has to store personal power. He became serious and said that to investigate the practices of sorcery and its ramifications was the reason he had been coming to Mexico on a regular basis. If there is something to it, I'm going to find out, he said with a smile. The fly was circling the table again. I shooed it away. What about Zen Buddhism? I asked. He looked at me surprised. What about it? Did you know that in the old days in China, when Buddhist monks wanted to build a road, they had to pick out all the worms from the dirt and move them to safety before they could proceed with their construction work? And I thought road work was slow here in Mexico, Carlos said with a laugh. That sounds absolutely tedious. Why would they do that? The Buddhists believe that to kill even the most insignificant life form is wrong. Take this fly, for instance. A Zen Buddhist sitting here would not swat it. Carlos gave me a curious look, as if the heat of the chilies had gotten the better of me. I told him that once my karate teacher, while lecturing to his students about the importance of Zen in martial arts, proceeded to squash all the flies that had landed on his desk. And with a rolled-up martial arts magazine to boot, I said. My teacher didn't see the irony of it all, but to me, it was a major revelation. After that, I could no longer respect him. You lost respect for your teacher because he killed a fly? Carlos asks. What does killing flies have to do with respect? Don't you get it? Not because he killed a fly, but because of what the fly represented. It was obvious that my teacher was trying to make us students believe he was a Zen master, but the flies were a dead giveaway. Carlos looked at me as if I were a fly, and he wanted to swat me. Don't you see? I lamented. Don't you get it? I sympathize with you, he said at last. I too lost respect for my teacher, Don Juan. He kept calling me a stupid imbecile, and since I knew I wasn't one, I couldn't respect him any longer. I thought he was deliberately insulting me, and that it was he who was stupid for not appreciating my worth. Luckily, I didn't stop seeing him, and now I respect him even more because I know he was right. I am an imbecile, and so are you. I didn't like it at all when he included me in his realization. We weren't yet on such familiar terms that he could insult me with impunity. In fact, when I thought about it, I realized that it was important to me that Carlos respect me. I was deliberately trying to make a good impression on him, to the point of eating green chili peppers. To my dismay, the basic premises that governed my behavior had not changed in spite of the recapitulation. Clara had warned me that it was not enough to merely recapitulate one's life. One must also act upon the understanding that a thorough examination of one's life brings. It's not the case that one is suddenly different, but that by being aware of one's habits, one has a moment's pause to act differently if one so chooses. What the recapitulation does is that by bringing awareness to the foreground, it gives one a chance to be different. Whether or not one takes that choice depends on one's energy at that particular moment. More often than not, I saw that in spite of my understanding of my own behavioral dynamics, my initial reaction was still the same as always. To impress my companion, I said, "Do you know a song called Ich liebe Kaborka?" Without waiting for his reply, I began to sing a few bars of a song Clara had taught me about a town in the Gran Desierto, settled by Germans. Carlos was not impressed. In fact, my singing seemed to embarrass him more than my trying to speak Spanish. He told me to pipe down. Instead of complying, I obstinately began to sing louder. I didn't know what had gotten into me, for I never sang in front of anyone. Carlos's presence seemed to be doing strange things to me. When I had finished the whole song, I began to laugh nervously. I knew the heat of the chili peppers had begun to singe my brain. For when I turned my head, I thought I saw Emilito's bird-like face peek out from behind the blue curtain that led to the other room. For a moment, he shook his finger at me, warning me not to indulge. It happened so fast that I knew it was an illusion, a product of wishful thinking, like the mirage of water on a desert road. My rational mind explained it away, saying that it must have been that woman cure, or the little girl that had poked her head out from behind the curtain. Nevertheless, I took Emelito's phantom warning to heart. I used all my effort to gain control over myself. "What are you looking at?" Carlos asked. "I just thought I saw someone." "But there's no one in the room," he said, concerned. "I mean, someone I knew in the past." I looked straight at him. A bubble burst, and I knew without a doubt that Carlos was the person Emelito had said the spirit would put me in contact with. Only there was no way I could tell him that without him thinking I was crazy. And that was the last thing I wanted anyone to think about me, especially Carlos. He seemed too sober, and I felt that only a stable, reasonable person would pass his scrutiny. "Do you know many people in Mexico?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He mentioned the names of several people, but Clara and Emelito were not among them. The woman came back, and Carlos gave her some bills to pay for the meal. They chatted while I watched the flies fighting over the crumbs on the table. Then the woman's eyes held mine for a moment. And in that instant, I knew we had met before. She was one of the women in the vision I had in Emelito's house. I stared at her terrified, but she did not smile to put me at ease as I would have liked. Rather, to my utter dismay, she regarded me with complete contempt. As we got up to leave, she followed us and whispered harshly in my ear. "Stop indulging, young lady," she said in English, "or you'll be in deep trouble." I reacted with anger and didn't want to believe her, but some part of me knew she was right. Chapter 5. Hermosillo. It was late afternoon by the time we arrived in Hermosillo. We stopped at the main intersection to allow a group of school children wearing blue blazers and knee pants to cross the street. They were accompanied by patrolmen carrying a yellow and white stop sign held up high. When the elderly man lowered the sign, the cars resumed their erratic movement, honking as they made their way through the intersection. With the windows rolled down, I could hear the bells of bicycles, car engines, and barking dogs. We passed houses with potted geranium plants decorating their tile steps, and ornate wrought iron fences and gates protecting the entrances. Carpets of burgundy bougainvillea covered parts of the rooftops, wrapping themselves around chimney stacks, or hanging in thick clusters from trellises or balcony railings. Carlos parked the car near the plaza, made of a circular park with benches on a gazebo in the center. "Let's stretch our legs for a moment," he said. "I want to stop at a bakery I know and buy some bread and also some fruit heading on to Guaymas." I was relieved to be able to get out of the car and walk before continuing our journey. The chili peppers I had eaten in Santa Ana had upset my stomach, and I needed to go to the restroom badly. "Now don't go following me in with your notebook," I said seriously. Carlos laughed. "It was my friend Larry. who did the study. I only assisted him on a few occasions. Along our drive, Carlos had entertained me with a story of how a friend of his at the university was interested in studying toilet behavior cross-culturally. To this effect, Larry kept a notebook on people's activities in restrooms. He had accurate records on who went into the public facilities, how long they spent at the urinals or in the cubicles, whether they wrote graffiti on the walls, how much toilet paper was consumed during each occurrence, whether they flushed, and if so, how many times, and when possible, information on whether they wiped themselves from the front to the back or the back to the front, and so on. His friend had complied quite a bit of data, complete with drawings on the subject of restroom activity, and had submitted his proposal to the National Institute for Mental Health for a research grant. Unfortunately, the cross-cultural study on toilet behavior was not approved due to cutbacks in government funding. I wouldn't mind living in this town, I said to Carlos after I came out of the restroom, and we were walking toward a small park. Everything is so lush and clean. Back there in Santa Ana, I got the impression that you didn't like Mexico, Carlos said, while stopping to tie his shoe. That's because I thought I was eating dog meat. This is a beautiful place. Where do the people work? In the fields, or in the mines in the hills, or in construction, Carlos said. While driving into town, I had seen plenty of evidence of construction work. Everywhere people were building or refurbishing buildings. It was obvious that there was no shortage of masons, carpenters, and plasterers here. Near the park, workers were digging a huge pit, perhaps to lay new pipes or to repair an old sewage system. I used to work in construction, I said with a touch of pride. Carlos looked at me in surprise. You don't seem like the redneck type, he said, laughing. I worked for one, though, as an apprentice, although I knew a lot more about carpentry than he apparently did. Lamont was working on a remodeling project and hired me to be his assistant, provided that I didn't complain about his radio that he kept on full blast on the country music station, and his foul language, a habit he had picked up in Vietnam. What type of things did you build? Our first project was a redwood deck using no nails whatsoever, only nuts and bolts. Quite a challenge. You see, he was a Buddhist from a commune in Oregon, and he was convinced that to use nails would desecrate the wood. I really needed the money, so I tolerated his eccentricities. The loud radio, his beer guzzling, his profanity, and his body odor. Whenever I wanted to quit, he kept telling me that I was working with a master carpenter who had no peers in the construction world, and that I should be paying him for his guidance. Sounds like quite a character, Carlos said. He was. After weeks, he still didn't trust me to use his power tools, which he dusted and oiled every night. I realized it was a situation of observing, hauling lumber, and sweeping up sawdust. That doesn't sound too exciting. It wasn't. Lamont had promised me hands-on experience. But the only actual hands-on experience I ever received throughout the entire project were his prods and pinches to various parts of my anatomy, I was so desperate, I developed a severe allergy to sawdust and began having fits of sneezing. I was going to hang in there for the rest of the summer, but the situation went from bad to worse. What happened? Carlos asked, concerned. He kept insisting I come to his house to see the new kitchen cabinets he had installed and share a joint of marijuana while listening to some Willie Nelson tapes. Well, I knew what that meant and realized the situation had become hopeless. I quit, and with the money I had saved, I entered the university, where things weren't all that much better, where men were concerned, if you know what I mean. Carlos didn't reply one way or the other. Let's look into some of the shops, Carlos suggested, stepping aside to avoid a hole in the ground. Do you need to buy any gifts for friends or relatives? I don't have any. Friends or relatives? Carlos inquired. Neither. He looked at me and shook his head. He sang the line of a Mexican song. No tengo ni madre ni padre, ni un perro que ladre. I have no mother or father, not even a dog that barks. That about sums up my situation, I said. I don't have any parents either, Carlos said. And I've learned that to have friends is too restricting. You always end up trying to please them or to fulfill their expectations. They pin you down. You're lucky to be an orphan. I wasn't an orphan, but I did not bother to correct Carlos's false impression. I realized that I wanted him to think I had no one in the world. It made me appear independent and mysterious. Besides, I had never felt I was part of my family anyway. As a child, I had always imagined that I was a changeling. A nurse must have gotten me mixed up in the hospital with the hundreds of other babies of the post-war baby boom. At least, that was what I used to tell myself. We entered one of the shops that lined the arcade around the plaza. It had the typical ceramic and leather goods you would find in any shop in Mexico. But in one corner, half hidden by a postcard rack, I found a thick wool poncho with braided fringe. I wanted to buy it, but Carlos insisted on paying for it himself. He said that it was a good idea to get it because even though the days were hot, the nights in Sonora were cool. After some casual browsing, we headed for the bakery that Carlos affirmed was the best in Sonora. You mean you sampled bread from all of them? I teased. Practically, he said. But from his lean, muscular physique, it was hard to believe that he had overindulged in baked goods. On our way to the bakery, we had to detour around another deep pit and road that sprang in front of us so suddenly that I nearly fell in and would have had Carlos not grabbed me by the arm and pulled me aside. We almost lost you there, he laughed. This isn't Los Angeles, where there are sidewalks and where the cars will stop for dazed pedestrians. Around here, you have to watch where you're going. I flushed with embarrassment as I realized that with my martial arts and sorcery training, I was still a walking zombie. I seemed to operate on the assumption that whoever I was with knew where they were going, and therefore I didn't have to pay attention. It was also true while driving, I trusted my companions implicitly and never knew how I got wherever I ended up. This was particularly this was particularly true when that companion was male. Unwittingly, it was a subtle way of relinquishing control to the opposite sex. I knew it was a dangerous way of proceeding. I remembered Clara's warning that in the sorcerer's world, everything was important, and that I always had to be attentive to details and assume responsibility for my actions. I kept my eyes downcast and avoided the pits and ruts in the road. I noticed that Carlos was exceedingly fleet-footed. His exquisite natural balance and prowess gave him an easy stride. For a while, I tried to imitate his style of walking, whereas I moved from the hips with little flexibility in my knees and ankles. Carlos flexed his knees and ankles and rolled off the balls of his feet, achieving a smooth feline sprint. Copying his stride, I deliberately flexed my knees and shifted my weight more toward the front of my feet, rather than landing heavy on my heels the way I normally walked. After a while, my calves began to ache. I felt I was using them for the first time in months. The last time I pushed them to the limit was when I was walking with Clara in the hills near her house. I could never keep up with her pace, but walking with her had rid me, at least temporarily, of the doctor's shuffle, as Clara had called my way of walking. Doctors, she had insisted, had a distinctive shuffle, moving from the hips as they sauntered from their consultation rooms to the examination room, or down the corridors of hospitals, which Clara claimed was the most they ever walk in their lives. They all have bad knees, she said, expounding on her generalization. It was not something I was prepared to dispute, for I had to agree that the few doctors I had come into contact with, including my own family physician, fell into her category of shuffling as they walked. I was aware that having been away from Clara's influence, I had again lapsed into my old habits, including my lazy hip walking pattern, shuffling along as if my listless legs resented the burden of having to carry my body to a place neither they nor I wanted to go. "What's the matter with your walk?" Carlos asked, concerned. "Did you injure your ankle back there on the road?" I realized trying to imitate his sprint made my stride appear awkward and uneven. One of my legs was actually dragging behind the other in an attempt to keep up with my head and shoulders. "Sit here while I go get the bread," he said, pointing at an iron bench across from the gazebo. "I'll go with you," I offered. "No," he said firmly. I had the distinct feeling he didn't want to be seen in my company. Obediently, I sat on the bench and watched him enter the store marked Panaderia across the street. Through the glass window, I could see him talking to a beautiful woman, perhaps in her late 20s, whom I assumed was a customer. She was elegantly dressed in a fashionable lime green blouse and beige skirt. Not a white uniform one would expect a bakery attendant to be wearing. I could see her attire because I moved closer to the door and actually peeked through the window. Then I saw Carlos hugging her in a most affectionate manner as she gave him the bag of bread he came for. Then she turned looked at me, and before I could hide, she winked at me, as if she knew me. I rushed back to the bench in the nick of time and pretended to be tying my shoelaces. But as I peeked up, I could see the woman had accompanied him to the door and was waving goodbye to Carlos and then to me across the road. A strange anger possessed me. I was fuming. What was going on? How is it that people seem to know me when I don't remember them? It couldn't just be coincidence. That witch woman in the restaurant, and now this beauty in the bakery? I felt there was a conspiracy going on, and I was somehow at the center of it. I remembered how Clara and Mr. Abelar tricked me in the past. They followed my movements from way back. And when I thought I met them for the first time, they already knew me intimately. The same thing was happening now. And it all began in the anthropology department when I suspected that I met Carlos before. I must have met him before, because otherwise, why would I be having a fit of jealousy now? As if he belonged to me from olden times. I tried telling myself that the woman was no doubt only a casual acquaintance of his, and hugged him only because people south of the border are more demonstrative than in the United States. Yet I couldn't help thinking that the woman wasn't Mexican at all, only very deeply tanned. I wondered who that gorgeous woman was, and why Carlos didn't want me to go with him into the bakery, and why she waved at me. "Let's move to another bench," Carlos said. "It's shadier over there by those trees." But I knew the real reason for moving was that he was hiding something. I was distraught to realize Carlos was a man with many secrets. Not that I didn't have secrets myself, which I wouldn't dream of revealing. Yet I had the unreasonable expectation that others had to be completely candid with me. We walked to the other side of the plaza and sat down on an identical white wrought iron bench. Only this one faced the opposite direction of the bakery, which was completely hidden by the foliage of trees. "Why is that your favorite bakery?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Carlos grinned mischievously. "Because they make such delicious bread," he said, handing me a round flat loaf sprinkled with pink sugar. "It must be the water or the flour they use. Try it and tell me if it isn't so." I attacked the bread with a ferocity that surprised me. But I had to admit, it was delicious. The rolls were a world apart from the bread in the United States. The sugar coating sweetened my disposition, and I decided not to ask about the bakery or the lovely woman I wasn't supposed to have seen. She was one of those secrets I hoped would be revealed in time. Carlos took out a bottle of mineral water from the sack and from his pocket, a Swiss Army knife which had a bottle opener attached to it, along with 6 or 7 other sharp implements. He pried off the cap and handed it to me. I finished the bread, then looked inside the bag to find 4 more small round loaves, each with a different color sugar coating. I picked out a green one. It tasted like the pink one. The coloring was not a different flavoring, but merely food color. "Why did you decide to become an anthropologist?" I asked, taking a sip of mineral water. Because the study of man is one of the most important endeavors one can engage in, especially studying man's belief systems, his cognitive structures, his culture as he lives it. I'm particularly interested in a phenomenological approach to the study of man. What do you mean by a phenomenological approach? A phenomenological approach to anthropology or sociology would be to take a person and leave them here in Osio to see how they went about interpreting a foreign culture. Are you planning on leaving me here? I asked in a moment of panic, to see how I fare. Carlos laughed. No, I was referring to an experiment I had cooked up with a professor in the sociology department. Not speaking the language or being familiar with the customs, he was going to live here in Hermosillo for a while, and I would be the observer and the guardian to make certain that no real harm came to him. The premise was that he went through his daily tasks of trying to arrange the world in recognizable terms. The taken for granted aspects of the world would, by their disruption, reveal themselves. They would make themselves available for investigation. I don't get it, I said, taking another bite of bread. In every simple act, he would have to find the natural order of phenomenon that for him, because he lacked membership, would be chaotic. In other words, he would have to create order in his day-to-day existence. This process of creating order would be the subject matter for our investigation. Since the professor's interest was the study of norms and how they are constituted in our daily lives, I thought it was a terrific plan, right up his alley. Did you do it? No. We were all set to leave for Mexico when he backed out at the last minute. Why was that? He kept thinking of all the contingencies. He was afraid of contracting some horrendous disease, or of being shot or robbed. All sorts of prejudices and personal considerations came into the picture. And so he never left Los Angeles, where he felt he was on familiar and therefore safe ground. It would have been a great study, I said. Then I had a frightening thought. Are you sure I'm not the guinea pig this time? Carlos leaned over. We're all guinea pigs in the hands of power, he whispered. Just then, a crow perched on top of the gazebo and started cawing. Carlos gestured to it with a nod. A reaffirmation, he said. I still don't see how that ties in with phenomenology, I said, getting back to the discussion at hand. Phenomenology takes the tacit faith we have in the reality of our everyday world and makes this the principal subject for investigation, Carlos explained. Exactly what tacit faith are you referring to? I asked. Carlos thought for a moment, as if to find the right words. For example, our assumption that the world is shared, that it is the same world for all normal individuals. Also, that there is temporal and spatial continuity to things. Isn't that true? Not necessarily. Sorcerers like Don Juan don't see the world the same way you or I do. Their training and membership in the sorcerer's tradition enables them to see the world in entirely different terms. Phenomenology questions the assumption that the world is intersubjectively shared by members, or rather makes that sharing the subject matter of its investigation. It also questions the a priori that what we call reality has a natural history, a causal basis which allows us to reasonably expect the world to continue in the future in much the same way it has in the past. Are you saying the world won't continue in the future as it has in the past? We don't know. But the fact that we assume that it does is prime matter for phenomenological investigation. These are presuppositions that cannot be accepted outright, but need to be the focus of investigation. Carlos talked about his interest in Husserl and Heidegger and the French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty. I told him about a sociology class I had taken taught by a professor in the sociology department who had devised a method for studying social interaction using a phenomenological approach. He called his deviant approach to study social interaction ethnomethodology. That was the professor I was going to take to Mexico, Carlos said. He taught a course called The Study of Deviant Behavior. That's the one, I agreed. Small world. I was going to be his disciple. He had a flock of students pending on his every word, much as a Zen master has students begging him to enlighten them. Did you become enlightened with this method? Carlos asked, teasing. I shook my head and took another bread from the bag. For a while, I was really impressed with what he had to say, I admitted. I even became his research assistant, without pay, just so I could study his methods. I went to his office on Saturdays to assist him on a project. He was studying the natural flow of conversation and had a theory that the squeaks of guinea pigs were not random, but a part of a complex system of coded communication. He had reels of tape recordings of guinea pig squeaks that he wanted me to decode and analyze according to his theoretical system. What happened? He asked. Did you discover a consistent pattern? I never stuck around long enough to find out, I said. One Saturday, the professor came into the office where I was transcribing a tape of squeaks and stood behind me for a while, making me believe he wanted to read over my shoulder to see if a pattern was emerging. Then I felt him lean closer and start to blow in my hair. When I moved, he sat down next to me and put a long arm around my shoulder, pulled me to him, and tried to kiss me. The old geezer had the gall to say he was certain I was interested in having an affair with him because I had come on Saturday to work when no one in their right mind works on Saturdays. But what cinched it for him was that I had told him I didn't expect to be paid for my work. Well, I only came because I genuinely thought he needed help, and because I thought I could learn something from his methods. You see, I was having a romance with knowledge. But it was completely misinterpreted. What happened? Carlos asked, expectantly. I shoved the heavy tape recording equipment off the table right into his lap. I was sure I crushed his guinea pig. You should have heard the squeals. Carlos looked at me curiously, as if he didn't know what to think. I ran out of the office, and that was my last encounter with the professor of deviant behavior and with his deviant methods of sociology. Well, there is a lot to be said for the phenomenological method, Carlos continued, all deviant professors aside. As he talked, I nervously munched on bread, trying not to drop too many crumbs on the ground. For whenever crumbs fell, a host of greedy little blackbirds with yellow eyes and long tail feathers rushed to gobble them up. Carlos's elucidation seemed to have an immediate truth to it. As far as I could tell, experiencing things directly, without the intervention of idealizations, was what Clara and Mr. Abelar had meant when they said that the energetic body, or double, could experience realities directly with our reason, which our reason could never comprehend. Take continuity of perception, for example, Carlos continued. According to phenomenologists, there is a continuity to perception, but it isn't a given. Perception itself is related only to the present, but this present is always seen in terms of having a past behind it and an open-ended future before it. I think I need a concrete example here, I said, trying to follow his explanation. Carlos pointed to the flowering jacaranda tree across the walkway near the gazebo. Take that tree over there, he said. You see that tree only here and now, but in seeing it, you are already presupposing that it was there yesterday in the same spot. And what's more, that it will continue to be there tomorrow, even when we are no longer sitting on this bench observing it. I had to agree. That tree looked like it had been there quite a while. In fact, the blossoms on the ground proved it was there before we had sat down on the bench. The flowers on the ground, Carlos said, noticing my glance, attest to the fact that they were shed prior to us sitting down here on the bench, since we didn't see any of them fall. Your mind tells you that the tree has a history, even though you and I haven't been here long enough to perceive it directly. I know that tree has a history, I agreed. It didn't just materialize in front of our eyes this instant. Exactly. But how do you know that? How can you be so certain? That is the prime material for phenomenological investigation. What's more, I know that you know that I am perceiving the same tree you are, and that we are having an intersubjective agreement as to what constitutes reality. But can we really be certain that we are seeing the same things? A phenomenological approach would question that intersubjective agreement too, or at least take such an a priori assumption into consideration in any discussion. My mind was reeling, trying to imagine what the phenomenologists were up to. To me, they were a kind of urban sorcerers, white magicians playing with mind and perception, much as the Clara and her group of sorcerers in Mexico had done while I was living among them. Only to the phenomenologists, it seemed more of an intellectual game. They lacked the actual energetic force to make the jacaranda tree disappear in front of one's eyes, upon realizing that its presence is mere interpretation. Nelida, Emilito, and Mr. Abelar, on the other hand, had the energy to make strange, inexplicable things happen by manipulating perception. While I was living in Clara's house, things kept disappearing, and then I would find them weeks later in the same places I must have looked 100 times. What's more, features of her house would shift depending on my vantage point. I could never explain those occurrences, and Clara had told me not to even try. It seemed very existential sitting on a park bench in a Mexican town, discussing the philosophy of Husserl, eating delicious bread. But somehow my mind kept flashing back to different questions. Not philosophical ones of whether or not the tree in the park exists in its own right, or because we are perceiving it via a power called intentionality. Such talk seemed to me filled with overtones of Thomas Aquinas trying to figure out how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. I had had enough of that kind of talk from the Jesuit priests at the schools I had attended. I wanted to know more about Don Juan, Carlos's informant. Since he was also a sorcerer, perhaps he knew John Michael Abelar, or of him. Then the thought struck me that perhaps he was Mr. Abelar, that he and Don Juan might be the same person. I wouldn't put anything past the sorcerers. I knew they existed on a different perceptual plane, one I was barred from by my lack of energy and understanding. Perhaps they were all there in the park with us, and I was incapable of seeing them because I did not have the means for interpreting their perceptual reality. Perhaps the sorcerers, unlike the tree in the park, had no taken for granted history or future. Perhaps they lacked the temporality and spatiality of things. So therefore, they didn't exist for us the way things in the world existed. Only an intentional analysis of the present, of perception in and of itself as making something present, Carlos continued, will give us an inkling of how we construct the world around us. Husserl called that living space the life world, meaning life as it is lived in the present. I think I follow you, I said tentatively, wiping the crumbs off my fingers. But I need another example. Take that other tree, Carlos said, this time pointing to a beautiful magnolia dotted with white flowers. The tree gives itself to us as there, as fully present, although I only see it from the front. I know that it has a back and sides, even though I don't see them. So besides knowing that it had been there yesterday, as well as that it will be there tomorrow, I also know that it has sides and a back and an inside and long roots under the ground, even though I don't immediately see them. That's what Husserl means by spatiality, being built into perception. We assume the tree is there in all its fullness. True, I agreed. It's not just a flat facade. I see a complete tree. But that very completeness is an accomplishment, an activity, rather than a given, Carlos explained. In the tree's presence, in the very fact that we see it as a tree here and now, lies a continuity of what we are still conscious of. What had flowed away and what is no longer intuited at all. The tree has a continuity of past and future, resulting from the memory of the tree we saw yesterday and the expectations we have that it will be there tomorrow. The tree's continuity is put there via our capacity for intentionality. We know it will be the same tree tomorrow as it is today, and it has spatiality, which allows us to see a front and a back and intuit its fullness. I took a sip of mineral water. Talking about phenomenology made me question perception. I had the certainty that if I gazed at that tree long enough, and if only I had enough sorcerer's energy, I could make it disappear. Since it really didn't have a past or a future, back or bottom, other than the one incorporated in our interpretation of it. The tree wasn't there the way I saw it at all. Perception linked with mind, or what Brentano called intentionality, was playing a gigantic trick on the perceiver. I felt I wanted to get to the bottom of this charade once and for all. I was tired of being fooled by one particular mode of perceiving that had been forced upon me by virtue of the fact that I had been born into a particular life world, or being in the world, as Husserl called it. I wanted more than anything to see the trees the way I had seen them under the guidance of Emilito, when I had climbed them, felt their roots, gazed at their leaves, talked to them, loved them, understood them. But now, all that was gone, as if the giant eye of that reality had closed and sealed that world from view, leaving me stranded on the wrong side of the door. If only Carlos could help me cross over to the other side. To understand sorcery is to expand one's capacity of perception, Mr. Abelar had once told me. Sorcerers, through the recapitulation and other practices, store enough energy to break the reflexivity of space and time. Their practices are deliberately geared towards disrupting the world as we live it. Now Carlos was saying the same thing, and I knew there must be an inherent truth to it. A sorcerer would look at that tree and not consider its there-ness as a given. Carlos continued. Sorcerers, according to Don Juan, try to break the mold of perception into which we were born. Do you think it's really possible to do that? I asked. I mean, break out of the mold of perceiving the world as we know it? Of course. According to Husserl, all perceptual acts point toward or intend some object, Carlos explained. In other words, all seeing is seeing something. All thinking is thinking something. All perception is perception of something, and perception projects itself toward its intended object, which is not a thing or a given, but an act of creation. And as an act of creation, it can be recreated or altered to fit a different mold. I get it. You're saying that as long as we see perception as a given, we are stuck, forever imprisoned. But if we realize that it is only phenomenon to be investigated, then different ways or alternatives to perception open up. That's right, Carlos said. And who knows what lies in the realm of possibilities available to man as a sentient being. The sorcerer's path is to break the boundaries of social perception, Carlos said. And I say social perception, not human perception. Because the sorcerer is able to perceive worlds not open to us as socialized beings, but which are, nevertheless, open as possibilities to sentient beings who have given up their social interpretations of the world as they live it. How did you get interested in studying perception? I asked Carlos. He was silent for a moment. It was a silence steeped in thought, rather than one born out of having run out of things to say. After a while, he said, "It was my good fortune to meet a man who, in my mind, is the most precise and remarkable person I've ever known. He has taken me as his apprentice and is teaching me to break the boundaries of perception. You see, you were right when you said in the office of the anthropology department that all this that is before us could not possibly be all there is to the world." He swept his hands in a graceful movement in front of us to include the trees, the cars, the boy on his bicycle, and the people strolling around the plaza. There is a way to break through the barriers set up by language and thought and perceive phenomena directly. That is what phenomenologists talk about. And that is what sorcerers actually do. I looked at Carlos. I knew why Emilito had insisted I attend the university. Not only so our paths would cross, but also so that I would have the capacity to conceptualize and share the new Nawal's predilection for the abstract. Carlos turned to look at me, and our eyes fixed for an indescribable instant in which my entire future was summed up and my past rushed to meet the present. I couldn't put it into words, but in that moment, no one else in the world existed. And just as people had their own shared agreements, we held a moment of agreement too, a silent intersubjectivity to which no one else was privy. I let out a sigh of relief that seemed to have been trapped inside me for eons, for I knew beyond doubt that this was the new Nawal. Fate had joined our paths, and forevermore we would journey together. "If you're game," Carlos said, breaking the silence, "we can blast through the world of perception. Let's find out if there's anything beyond this that we have always taken for granted. He laughed for a moment to break the seriousness, but I knew he meant what he said. And somewhere in the depth of silence, I agreed. On that park bench, I silently agreed to do whatever it took to accompany him to the ends of the earth and beyond. I leaned my head against his, as if to merge forces. He reached up and tousled my hair the way Nelida had, and I knew our fates were sealed forever. We got up without any spoken words or promises, for none had to be made. We both knew at the deepest level that something had changed in the most subtle way. We were not the same as when we had sat down on the bench. We were joined by an intent that did not stem from the social order. It existed prior to our encounter in the office of the anthropology department, and prior yet to the vision of another reality. Something else had set up our appointment on this park bench and made possible this journey of power. But what that force was, we could not fathom. For it originated within and emerged from the inconceivable depths of silence. Yet that same force would catapult us to freedom.